Melania Trump is denied access to her own jet. What they were hiding will shock you. The West Palm Beach airport awaited the tarmac setting of an evening sun that cast the liquid gold all over the pristine white jet that was awaiting its next departure. For Melania Trump, it was to be another smooth flight. She walked to the aircraft calmly, her tailored cream-colored pantsuit and silk scarf rippling slightly with the breeze. Her security personnel followed at some distance, falling back a step or two from her, discreetly showing that she valued time alone before she boarded. Just as Melania stepped up to the stairs to reach the plane, she sensed that something was wrong. The people on the ground were nervous. They did not make eye contact with each other, hurrying and making uncoordinated movements. Something was off. Still, she continued forward, her sharp instincts already on alert. At the base of the staircase stood Paul Brennan, the pilot, a man she'd flown with countless times. Paul, a familiar presence, was reliable, professional, and unflappable. But today, his demeanor was anything but reassuring. His usual confident posture was replaced by a stiff one, his hazel eyes darting nervously toward the black SUV parked a short distance away. "Good evening, Mrs. Trump," Paul greeted her, his voice steady but lacking its usual warmth. "Evening, Paul," Melania replied, her tone polite yet clipped. "Are we ready for takeoff?" Paul hesitated, glancing down at the tablet in his hand. "Ma'am, I'm afraid I can't let you board." The words hung in the air like a sudden gust of wind, unexpected and jarring. Melania's steps faltered, but her composure didn't break. She tilted her head slightly, her piercing blue eyes narrowing. "Excuse me? I've received orders," Paul continued, his voice quieter now, as though afraid of being overheard. "You're not cleared to board this flight." Melania's jaw clenched in a gesture. She made a great effort to keep stoic. "Orders from whom?" Paul squirmed uncomfortably, his gaze now fixed at a spot over her shoulder. "Ma'am, I don't have all the details. It's classified." "Classified," she said it one word, yet it carried a weight that made Paul flinch back. Melania advanced a step or two, heels clicking sharply off the pavement. This was her plane, her flight. She would extract from him whomever made these decisions, and why they did. "Mrs. Trump, please." Paul held a hand out like he could really stop her as she took 2 steps forward, her eyes like ice. His gesture was either fearlessness or fanaticism, perhaps a little too confident to be outright defiance. Mrs. Trump made no response in words, although her voice sent them all a deadly calm. She turned her eyes toward the black SUV. Windows like darkly tinted opaqueness. "Whose bright idea is it to keep me away from my aircraft?" The crew behind them stared frozen, eyes jumping between Melania and Paul, uncertain which to support. It was that sort of tension, one that seemed to amplify the faintest noises, the muffled hum of an engine or the soft caress of wind. "I need answers, Paul," Melania demanded, her tone sharp enough to slice through the heavy air. "And I need them now." Paul hesitated, his internal conflict written all over his face. His hand still blocked her path, but his resolve was wavering. "Ma'am, I'm just following orders," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Melania's piercing gaze locked onto his, unrelenting. "Then you'd better tell me where those orders came from, because this doesn't end here." Paul's silence said it all, and in that moment, Melania knew that this was no ordinary delay. Something much bigger was at play, and she was determined to uncover it. Melania Trump's heels clicked sharply against the tarmac as she stepped back from Paul Brennan, taking a moment to absorb the absurdity of what she just heard. Denied boarding her own jet with no real explanation. It was unthinkable. Yet here she was, staring down a man who had always been a picture of professionalism, but now seemed like a bundle of nerves caught in a web of secrecy. "Paul," she said, her voice growing colder, "you're making a grave mistake. If this is some kind of misunderstanding, I suggest you resolve it immediately." Paul looked down as if hoping the ground might swallow him whole. "Mrs. Trump, please understand this isn't personal. I've been given direct orders, and I can't go against them." Melania's patience was wearing thin. "Direct orders from whom? My staff? The airline?" Someone had better explain why I'm being treated like a stranger at my own jet. Paul swallowed hard, his atoms apple-bobbing. I can't disclose that, ma'am. I'm only doing my job. Melania took a step closer, her presence commanding despite her smaller frame. Your job is to fly this plane, Paul. So either you start doing it, or I'll make sure this is your last assignment. Paul winced, but he stood firm, his hands still raised, his body practically holding her in check. Mrs. Trump, I won't let you get on, he said with such tension the air was about to crack apart. The people standing behind them almost stopped breathing for fear of some catastrophe. Melania's harsh gaze was sweeping the scene, landing on the black SUV parked nearby. She hadn't seen it when she arrived, and now it sat there like a silent specter, its tinted windows shrouding whatever or whoever was inside. She felt a knot in her stomach that something wasn't right. Then she saw two men in dark suits standing near the nose of the jet, arguing as if they didn't have anywhere else to discuss whatever it was they were trying to say to each other. Their gestures sharp, their voices too low to carry across the tarmac. They were part of no one's usual crew. She had never seen either of them. Who were they, and what were they doing here? Paul, she said again, her voice rising over the thick air. If you think I'm leaving here without being told what all this is for, you are sadly mistaken as to who you're dealing with. Paul stole a nervous peek at the three men in business suits, turning back to Melania. Miss, I truly can't talk any further than that. Can you please leave the terminal, for your safety? My safety? Melania's anger was now mixed with incredulous disbelief. You think denying me access to my plane and hiding behind vague excuses is keeping me safe? You're lying to me, Paul, and I don't take kindly to liars. Paul's face reddened, his internal struggle visible to anyone watching. He lowered his voice, leaning in slightly. Mrs. Trump, I swear to you, I do not want to do this, but there's more going on here than you realize. I'm following orders because I have no choice, he said quietly. There's always a choice, Melania shot back. And you're making the wrong one. Before Paul could respond, one of the suited men broke away from his conversation and walked briskly toward them. His expression was grim, his presence imposing. Captain Brennan, he said, his voice clipped and authoritative. We need a word. Now. Paul hesitated, looking over at Melania before reluctantly stepping aside. The man in the suit, tall and broad-shouldered with dark glasses that obscured his eyes, gestured for Paul to step a few paces away with him. Their conversation was low, but Melania caught a few snippets of words, classified and protocol among them that only increased her suspicions. Her phone buzzed in her hand. A call from her assistant. She answered quickly, her tone brisk. I'm being denied access to my jet. Find out who authorized this and get back to me immediately. As she hung up, her gaze returned to Paul and the suited man. Paul looked increasingly uncomfortable, his shoulders stiff, his head nodding slightly in what seemed like reluctant agreement. When the man finally walked away, Paul turned back, pale-faced and walking like a zombie. Mrs. Trump, he said softly, his voice lower than ever before, please, I'm asking you one last time. Go back to the terminal. I cannot let you onto this flight. Melania's expression was ice. And I'm telling you one last time. Paul, I'm not leaving without an explanation. Paul opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. His hesitation spoke volumes, and Melania knew she had him cornered. Whatever he wasn't saying, whatever orders he was following, it was clear this situation wasn't just about protocol, it was personal, and she wasn't about to back down. Paul Brennan felt his chest tighten as he stood frozen in front of Melania Trump. He had flown thousands of VIPs during his 2 decades as a pilot, but nothing compared to this. The burden of his orders, the threatening figure of the suited agents, and the unrelenting glare of Melania's piercing eyes were all bearing down on him like an inescapable storm. Paul, for his part, prided himself on being professional. However, today, he began questioning everything. The orders he had received that morning were vague but direct. Ground the flight, deny passenger 1 access under all circumstances, do not disclose the reason, and comply with further instructions from agents on site. The email had come from an unfamiliar address, But the directives were backed by official-sounding language and a promise of severe consequences for disobedience. When he'd called the airline for clarification, he'd been redirected to a government contact who confirmed the instructions. What was troubling him, though, wasn't the secrecy, was the tone. There had been no mention of technical issues, no explanation about potential threats, just a chilling warning. For her safety, keep her off the plane. Paul's mind raced as he looked at Melania, standing firm on the tarmac with the authority of someone who'd spent years navigating powerful, high-stakes environments. She wasn't just angry. She was suspicious, and that suspicion was a ticking time bomb. He hesitated, his fingers brushing the edge of the clipboard he carried as if the papers it held could offer some kind of reassurance. They didn't. "Mrs. Trump," he said carefully, "you're not just a passenger. Your safety is paramount, and that's why these measures are in place. I can't say more, but I need you to trust that this is for the best." Melania's eyes narrowed. "You keep saying this is for my safety, but you can't give me one concrete reason why. Do you even know why you're doing this? Or are you just following orders like a robot?" Paul flinched. Her words cut deep, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. He didn't know why. He didn't know who had ordered this, nor what they were trying to keep her away from. All he knew was that his career and reputation, and possibly even his freedom, hung in the balance if he went against orders. He looked to the SUV once more. The men hadn't budged, but their presence had a malign influence over him like a shadow. He thought of his family, his wife, his 2 children, and everything he had built with years of effort. Wasn't it worth it all? Paul's thoughts were cut short by a call for him. One of the agents, Agent Graham, strode up, step after measured step. "Captain Brennan." "A word," Graham said, his tone sharp and commanding. Paul nodded, then returned to Melania. "Please, ma'am, wait here." Melania crossed her arms but didn't argue, her sharp gaze following Paul as he walked a few paces away with Graham. "Captain," Graham began in a low voice, "you're doing fine. Stick to the plan. Keep her off the plane and out of the loop. This isn't a negotiation." Paul's jaw tightened. "I hear that, but I don't feel like they're giving me nearly enough information about how to really do this correctly. She keeps asking me stuff that I do not know, and it's getting worse." "So not your job," Graham replied. "Just shut up and take orders. And the less you know, the safer you will be. Right?" Paul was silent. He looked back at Melania, who was standing near the stairs with that serene but resolute look, then at the black SUV. The words, "the less you know, the safer you are," repeated in his mind. "What precisely is on that plane?" Paul finally asked. Graham darkened his face. "You don't want to know, Captain. Trust me on that. Just do your job." Graham walked away, and Paul stood there in silence, his thoughts swirling. He looked back at Melania, who hadn't moved. Her patience was clearly wearing thin, but her resolve was stronger than ever. Paul knew he was running out of time to make a choice. He could either continue to obey and live with the burden of never knowing the truth, or he could stand up and risk everything. Paul Brennan walked back down the stairs with the weight of Graham's words on his shoulders. He looked at Melania Trump, who was now pacing slightly, her frustration barely concealed behind her composed exterior. Every instinct screamed that the situation was far worse than anyone would ever let on. He just did not know how far it was, or how bad things really were. Melania had stopped pacing at the sight of Paul approaching. Her eyes were narrowed. "Well, am I going to get to hear what's really going on, or should I continue to guess?" Paul hesitated, his eyes snapping to the jet, then to the black SUV parked ominously far in the distance. He felt torn, his orders versus growing intuition that something was very seriously wrong. "Mrs. Trump," he began carefully, "I have always done everything by the book my entire career, but now, I don't know if I should be following orders." Her face softened ever so slightly, but her voice did not waver. "Then do the right thing, Paul. Tell me what you know." Before Paul could respond, a low hum emanated from the direction of the plane. Melania and Paul turned simultaneously, their attention drawn to the cockpit. The plane's auxiliary power unit had been engaged, and the faint vibration in the air was unmistakable. Someone was preparing the jet for departure. Paul's stomach sank. "Who's in the cockpit?" he muttered. more to himself than anyone else. Melania didn't wait for him to answer. She moved toward the stairs, her stride purposeful, but Paul stepped in front of her again, blocking her path. "Mrs. Trump, wait." "For what?" she shot back, her voice rising slightly. "Someone's about to take off in my plane, and I'm supposed to stand here and let it happen?" Paul's hands clenched at his sides. "Let me check first. If this is what I think it is," he muttered, his brain racing with possibilities. Melania didn't budge, but her eyes seemed to penetrate all the way through him. "You have 5 minutes, Paul." "Then I'm going up there myself." Paul nodded urgently and pounded his way up the metal steps. The door to the cockpit was barred against him. He rapped on the door sharply, his voice firm. "This is Captain Brennan. Open the door." For a moment, nothing. Then the door cracked open just enough to reveal a face. A man's face that was not recognizable to Paul. A disheveled and pale man gave Paul a frightened look before closing the door shut again. Paul's heart beat rapidly. The man certainly didn't belong in the crew. He knocked on the door harder this time. "Open the door now, or I'll override it." Inside, he heard the man speaking hurriedly, but the words were muffled. Paul didn't wait for an invitation. He reached for the emergency override panel, inputting the code that would grant him access. The door clicked open, and Paul stepped inside. What he saw made him freeze. Inside the cockpit, the man that had sat earlier in the pilot's chair now sat shakily in the co-pilot's chair, holding onto a tablet that displayed one after another encrypted messages. Behind him, bolted down to the floor, was a large, unmarked crate. It was bound by reinforced locks and bore no labels or markings except a tiny faint emblem Paul had seen before, the seal of a major government agency. The man in the co-pilot seat turned to Paul, his voice quivering. I didn't have a choice. They told me I'd be safe if I just did what they said." Paul stepped closer, his voice calm but firm. "Who are you, and what's in the crate?" The man shook his head, tears welling in his eyes. "I can't. They'll kill me if I talk." "You're already here," Paul said, his tone softening to undefined whatever's happening. "It's already out of your hands to undefined, but if you tell me what's going on, I can help." The man hesitated, then glanced at the crate undefined. "It's not just cargo," he whispered. "Undefined, it's evidence. Files, recordings, everything they don't want the public to see." Paul's breath caught. "Undefined, evidence of what?" "Undefined crimes," the man replied, his voice barely audible. "Undefined, powerful people. Undefined corruption. They're using this flight to move it somewhere no one can find it." Paul's mind reeled as the implications sank in. This wasn't about safety or protocol. It was about burying the truth. He turned to the man. "And you? Why are you here?" "I'm the one who leaked it," the man admitted, his voice breaking. "They caught me, but they need me alive to decode the files. If I don't go with them, the crate is useless." Paul felt a chill run through him. He looked back at the crate, then at the man. "We're not letting this plane take off," he said firmly. "Stay here." He hurried back down the stairs to where Melania awaited, her arms crossed, her expression tense. "What's on that plane?" she demanded. Paul didn't hesitate. "Evidence. Enough to ruin some very powerful people, and a man who says they'll kill him if he doesn't comply." Melania's face darkened. "They're using my plane to cover up a crime." "Yes," said Paul, "and we need to stop them before they succeed." The puzzle pieces had all fallen into place. Now the stakes were higher than anyone could have thought. But how far were they willing to go to make sure the truth came out? The air around the jet felt charged, as if the tension of the situation had a physical weight. Paul Brennan stood at the bottom of the stairs, his mind racing. The revelation of what was on the plane, the crate filled with evidence and the terrified man forced to transport it, was more than he could process. Yet there was no time to hesitate. Every second the plane remained operational was a second closer to the truth being erased. Melania Trump's voice cut through his thoughts like a knife. "What do we do now, Paul?" Her calm yet commanding tone made it clear that she wasn't asking for his opinion. She was demanding a solution. Paul glanced in the direction of the plane before looking at the black SUV parked behind it. There were agents watching through the windows of the car, silhouettes barely making out against the dark glass. His gut told him they weren't just there to monitor. This was to make sure that this mission didn't fizzle. And if that meant knocking someone out, Paul knew that was something that wouldn't hold them back. "We need to ground this plane permanently," Paul said, his voice low but firm. "If it takes off, the evidence and that man are as good as gone." Melania nodded, her expression hardening with determination. "Then let's ground it." But before they could act, the sound of car doors slamming drew their attention. Two men in dark suits stepped out of the SUV, their movements brisk and purposeful. Agent Wallace, the elder of the two, walked ahead, his face a mask of barely concealed irritation. His younger counterpart, Agent Graham, followed close on his heels, his posture tense and alert. "Mrs. Trump," Wallace called out, his voice carrying an air of forced politeness. "I'm going to have to insist that you leave the premises immediately. This situation is under federal jurisdiction, and your presence here is complicating matters." Melania turned to face him, her chin held high. "Complicating matters? This is my plane, and I have every right to know what's happening on it." "Your right to know doesn't outweigh national security," Wallace snapped. "Please step back, or I'll have no choice but to escort you off the premises." Paul stepped forward, his voice steady but laced with defiance. "You're not being honest, Wallace. There's no security threat here, is there? This is about hiding something you don't want anyone to find." Wallace's eyes narrowed. "You're out of line, Captain, and you're out of excuses," Paul shot back. "I've seen what's in the cockpit. I know about the evidence and the man you've got locked in there." Graham stiffened at the mention of the man in the cockpit, but Wallace's expression remained stone cold. "You've crossed a line, Captain Brennan. This has nothing to do with you anymore." "It did when you borrowed my plane to smuggle and whatever it is you're trying to smuggle," Paul shot back, "and I'm not letting this plane leave the ground." Wallace's jaw flexed, and for a moment Paul thought he would attack. Instead, the agent turned to Melania. "Mrs. Trump, I would strongly advise you to reconsider your actions. There are forces at play here that you can't begin to understand." Melania didn't flinch. "What I understand is that you're hiding behind vague threats and secrecy to cover up something you don't want the public to see. And I won't stand for it." Wallace took a step closer, lowering his voice. "You're making a mistake. If this plane doesn't take off, there will be consequences. For you, for him." He pointed at Paul. "For everyone." Melania's eyes burned with determination. "The only mistake here is thinking I can be intimidated." As the standoff continued, Paul's mind worked furiously. He had to act quickly before Wallace or Graham made their move. His eyes darted to the plane, then back to the agents. "Melania," he said quietly, "we can stop this." "How?" she asked, her voice low enough that only he could hear. Paul leaned in slightly. "The fuel line. If I disable it, the plane won't be able to take off." Melania thought about this for a moment before nodding minutely. "Do it." Paul went to work quickly, moving toward the fuel truck, parked a short distance away. He grabbed a wrench from the toolkit on the truck and crouched by the jet's fuel intake, working with practiced precision. Wallace and Graham shouted in protest, but Melania stepped between them and the plane, her presence alone enough to keep them at bay. "You're making a big mistake," Wallace barked, his voice rising in frustration. "Do you even know what you're messing with?" Melania's calm voice cut through his shouting. "No, but I know enough to see right through your lies. And I'm going to make sure that truth comes out." Within a moment, Paul was done. He stood back, his palms dripping with grease, but his face hardened into determination. "It's over. That plane is staying right here," Wallace growled, his face blackening with anger, when he was preempted by sirens. More police cars pulled onto the runway, and further SUVs joined them. Their flashing lights illuminated the surroundings like a morbid glow show. Melania's gaze turned toward Wallace, who smiled faintly at her. "Looks like we'll have an audience for the truth after all." Paul exhaled deeply, his heart pounding. The plane was grounded, but the battle was far from over. The evidence, the frightened man in the cockpit, the agents determined to keep their secrets, all of it pointed to a much larger fight ahead. And now, with the truth finally beginning to surface, Paul and Melania knew they had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But neither of them was willing to back down. The cacophony of sirens grew louder as more vehicles arrived on the tarmac, their flashing lights casting long, flickering shadows across the jet and surrounding area. Melania Trump stood tall, straightening up, her face an image of serenity defiance. Years had prepared her for this drama and crisis of power, but something felt different. It wasn't about politics or looks. It was much bigger. Paul Brennan stood by her side, his greasy hands having just shut off the fuel line in the jet, his breathing ragged. He had come to his decision, one that would almost certainly cause him to lose his career. But as he looked at Melania, he knew he was far from standing alone. Her resolve was unwavering, her presence a force that seemed to halt the agents and their threats. Agent Wallace, emitting an audible seethe, glared at the two of them. Frustration and anger barely contained, stepped forward once more, his voice barely controlled. "Mrs. Trump, you've meddled in a federal operation. Do you know what you just did?" Melania snapped at him, her blue eyes sharp and unyielding. "What I've done is stop you from abusing your authority. You used my plane to transport evidence and a prisoner, all while lying to me about why I was being kept off. The only question left is why." Wallace's composure faltered for a split second before he recovered. "You're out of your depth. Mrs. Trump, this has to do with national security. Your interference puts lives at risk." "Don't insult my intelligence," she retorted icily. "You're not saving lives. You are covering up secrets. Secrets that would blow apart great people, and you believe that you could make use of me as a bargaining chip to wipe out all these things." Paul couldn't help but respect the tenacity with which she said all these words. She stood nose to nose with men holding behind them the might of government, yet didn't even bat an eyelid. Rather, defiance grew on her. At the sight of her vision, she spotted the black SUV. A man came out from the driver's side. The flashing light blurred the rest of his face, though it revealed the length. Tall and austere-looking and full of himself as Wallace and Graham. That guy set an aura to heighten tension in an already tensed-up air. "Who's that?" Melania asked, her voice steady. Paul followed her gaze. "Another agent, probably. Or worse." The man approached with measured steps, his gaze fixed on Melania. When he spoke, his tone was calm but carried an unmistakable undercurrent of menace. "Mrs. Trump, I'm Special Agent Castillo. I've been briefed on the situation, and I'm here to ensure it doesn't escalate further." Melania raised an eyebrow. "It already has, Agent Castillo. Your operation has been exposed. The police are here. This plane isn't leaving. And exactly what do you think you can do now?" Castillo's lips curved into a thin smile. "You've created a spectacle, Mrs. Trump, but you've also placed yourself in a precarious position. What you've done here will have consequences, not just for you, but for everyone involved." "That sounds like a threat," Melania replied, unfazed. "It's a fact," Castillo said. "You think you've stopped something by grounding this plane, but you've only delayed the inevitable. The evidence will disappear, the man in the cockpit will be taken care of, and you'll be answering questions you don't want to answer." Melania drew closer to him, her voice dropping to a deadly calm. "If you think I am afraid of you, you are mistaken. I have faced greater threats than you, and every time I come out stronger. So go ahead, do your worst. But know this, the truth always comes out. Always." Paul saw the look between them, part amazement, part terror. They both knew they stood on shaky ground, but also Melania was correct. The truth is something that emerges to the open light, even when people have their best tries at hiding it. Car doors popped open. The police have arrived. Some uniformed police move cautiously to their position with hands resting over the belts of their uniforms. A woman steps forward, firm-faced, for this is she, the one leading the bunch. "What is going on here?" she asked, her eyes darting between Melania, Paul, and the agents. Wallace stepped in quickly, his tone clipped. "This is a federal matter. We have everything under control." The officer raised an eyebrow. "That's not what it looks like. We received a call about suspicious activity involving this jet. Care to explain?" Before Wallace could answer, Melania said, "Officer, this plane was being used to transport evidence and a prisoner without proper authorization. These men are trying to cover it up, and when I confronted them, they threatened me." Wallace's face darkened. "She's exaggerating. This is a classified operation, and her interference is jeopardizing its success. The officer turned to Melania, clearly weighing her words. Is that true, ma'am? Did they threaten you? Melania nodded, her face unmoving. They let me know there would be a price to pay if I did not back off. But I will not. The evidence in that plane is too significant to ignore. The officer turned to Paul. And you? Paul paused for a second before nodding. She's telling the truth. I've seen the evidence myself. They were going to take off before anyone could actually stop them. The officer's expression turned stone-like. She turned to her team. Secure the plane. No one gets on or off until we get a full explanation. Wallace and Castillo exchanged a tight glance, but said nothing. The game had shifted, and they were no longer in control. As the officers moved to surround the jet, Melania stepped back, her composure unbroken. She turned to Paul. You did the right thing. Paul let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. So did you. The wheels of justice had been set in motion, but Melania and Paul both knew this was just the beginning. The truth was finally coming to light, but the fight to protect it was far from over. The tarmac was now a flurry of activity. Police officers secured the area around the jet, their radios crackling with updates as they coordinated efforts to ensure no one left without answering questions. The flashing lights of their vehicles cast eerie patterns on the jet's sleek surface, making the scene feel like a chaotic chessboard with the pieces finally moving into place. Melania Trump stood at the center of it all, her presence commanding attention. She glanced at the agents who were now huddled together, whispering furiously. Their air of authority had shifted into something else. Unease, maybe even fear. They had lost control of the narrative, and Melania intended to make sure it stayed that way. Paul Brennan stood beside her, his nerves still frayed, but his resolve stronger than ever. He had taken the biggest gamble of his life by going against protocol, but as he looked at the grounded jet, he knew he'd made the right choice. Mrs. Trump, he said quietly, I don't think we've seen the full scope of what's going on here. Melania nodded, her gaze never leaving the agents. This isn't just about that evidence. It's who they're keeping it for, and to what extent. Paul followed her gaze, his mind racing. The crate he had seen in the cockpit was more than a collection of evidence, was an arsenal against important people, individuals who operated with the strings pulling most people beneath their radar. The man inside the cockpit represented the key in all this, a whistleblower whose mere existence threatened such secrets. Do you think he'll open up? Paul asked, his voice low. Melania turned to him, her expression unreadable. If he doesn't, they'll make sure he disappears. And if he does, they'll make sure he's silenced anyway. Paul's stomach churned at the implications. So what now? Melania took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the scene. We keep the pressure on. They operate in secrecy because they rely on fear and silence. The moment the public catches wind of this, their power starts to crumble. Nearby, Special Agent Castillo pushed out of the huddle, his face drawn into a mask of forced calm. He made his way towards Melania and Paul in slow, deliberative steps. Mrs. Trump, he began, measured in tone. I believe it is high time we scale this back down. Melania's eyebrow rose in response. De-escalate? That's an interesting choice of words, considering that your operation involved hijacking my plane and threatening me. Castillo didn't bat an eyelash. You misunderstand the stakes here. This isn't about you. It's about protecting national security. National security, Melania repeated, her voice dripping with disdain. That's your excuse for everything, isn't it? What's really on that plane, Agent Castillo? What are you so desperate to keep hidden? Castillo's lips pressed into a thin line. That's classified. Of course it is, she said, her tone sharp. But let me make something clear. Your secrecy doesn't scare me, undefined. Only makes me more determined to expose the truth. Before Castillo could respond, one of the police officers approached. Ma'am, we've secured the cockpit. The man inside asks to see you. Melania cast a glance to Paul, and then back again at the cop. Let's go. Take me to him. Mrs. Trump, sir. Castillo snapped in his face. I cannot do that. This guy's a federal detainee. He doesn't have access. Melania didn't flinch 1 inch as she replied. You lost the badge the instant you made it into a cover-up. Undefined, if you wish to stop me, proceed. But I don't think you want to explain that to the media waiting outside. Castillo's jaw tightened, but he didn't stop her. Melania and Paul followed the officer toward the jet, their steps purposeful. When they reached the cockpit, the door was open, and the man inside looked up with a mixture of relief and apprehension. He was younger than Melania had expected, perhaps in his mid-30s, with a gaunt face and dark eyes that betrayed exhaustion. His hands were cuffed, but he clutched a small tablet like it was his lifeline. "You're Melania Trump," he said, his voice hoarse. "I am," she replied. "And you are?" "Just someone who wanted to do the right thing," he said, "but I didn't realize how dangerous that would be." Melania stepped closer, her voice softening slightly. "Tell me what they're hiding." The man hesitated, his eyes darting toward the officers outside. "If I tell you, I won't live to see tomorrow." Paul spoke up, his voice steady. "You've already taken the risk by coming this far. If you tell us the truth, we can protect you." The man exhaled shakily, then nodded. "The crate, it has documents, recordings, evidence of corruption at the highest levels. Politicians, CEOs, foreign operatives, they're all connected. If this gets out, it'll bring them all down." Melania's expression hardened. "And that's why they're so desperate to keep it quiet." The man nodded. "They'll stop at nothing to make sure it disappears, and they'll stop at nothing to make sure I disappear with it." Melania turned to Paul, her mind already racing with possibilities. "We need to get this story out now. If the public knows, they won't be able to bury it." Paul nodded, but his eyes lingered on the man. "And what about him? They'll come after him no matter what." Melania looked at the man, her gaze steady. "We'll protect you, but you need to trust us." For the first time, the man's posture relaxed just a little. He had started to expose the truth, and the battle ahead was far from one, and he and Melania and Paul knew this. The courage and determination this battle would try to break into pieces had not been tested by anything yet. The truth is out, or at least it began to surface, and the air was still thick on the tarmac, but the tide turned. The police presence grew stronger, as more officers scoured the jet, interviewing the crew. The man in the cockpit, visibly shaken, was at last beginning to feel safe again. He was no longer merely a prisoner, but the key that could unravel an enormous web of corruption. Melania Trump stood outside the jet, her figure cast by the flashing red and blue lights. She had survived public storms before, but this was different. This was greater than her. This was bigger than any single person. Surveying the scene, she knew that the battle ahead would be fierce. Powerful people wouldn't just roll over and let their secrets come to light. They would fight back with everything they had. Agent Wallace and Agent Castillo stood off to the side, their earlier confidence now replaced with quiet tension. They had underestimated her resolve, her ability to adapt and act decisively, and now they were watching as the operation they'd so carefully orchestrated crumbled before their eyes. Paul Brennan joined Melania, his hands still smeared with grease from grounding the jet. His nerves were frayed, but relief was etched in his body language. He had done what was right. It was only that it would cost him everything. "Mrs. Trump," he said, breaking the silence, "we've stopped them for now, but this is just the beginning." She nodded, her gaze fixed on the jet. "It always is. They'll regroup, find another way to hide this, but we won't let them. The truth is out now, and once it is out, it cannot be buried again." Paul exhaled sharply. "What next?" Melania turned to him and spoke in a firm tone. "We guarantee that the evidence gets to the right place, the media, the authorities, or whoever can open wide enough windows into what is happening here. If we fail, they will bury it, and all of this would have amounted to nothing." Paul looked at her, a newfound respect in his eyes. "You really believe we can win this?" "I believe we have to try," she said simply. "If we don't, who will?" Nearby, the man from the cockpit was being escorted out of the plane by officers. His cuffs had been removed, and though he still looked nervous, there was a hint of relief in his expression. He stopped in front of Melania and Paul. "Thank you," he said softly. "You didn't have to do this, but you did. That means more than you know." Melania smiled at him reassuringly. "It's not over yet, but we'll get there." The man nodded and walked toward a police vehicle, surrounded by officers. Paul watched him go, then turned back to Melania. "You have guts," I will give you that. Most would have turned around and run for cover. Melania did not flinch an eyelid. Never could she have turned around and so retreated. Behind her back, reporters began assembling behind the tarmac's outer rim, clicking cameras as they attempted to capture the moment. The story was already spreading, and Melania knew it would be a matter of time before the full truth and depth of the matter started to surface. She stood up straight, with a calm, composed expression on her face, turning towards the cameras. It wasn't just about her. It was for all of those who needed to know the truth. "Mrs. Trump, what do you have to say for tonight's events?" a reporter yelled from the crowd. Melania hesitated for a moment, and then went ahead, her clear voice slicing through the cacophony. "What happened here tonight is a reminder of how far some will go to keep the truth hidden. But it's also a reminder of how important it is to stand up, no matter the cost. This isn't over. The truth will come out." Her words hung in the air as the cameras captured every moment. Paul stood beside her, feeling a strange mix of exhaustion and hope. He had stepped out in faith, and here he was, part of something much bigger than himself. As the crowd buzzed with questions and speculation, Melania turned to him and said softly, "This is just the beginning." Paul nodded. "Then let's make it count. The story of courage and truth doesn't end here. It's a fight we all share. Standing up for what's right, even when it feels impossible, is what makes change happen." If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts below. Subscribe and follow for more powerful stories of resilience, justice, and the fight for what truly matters. Together, we can keep shining a light on the truth.